Welcome! Thank you for watching this Houston Public Library virtual program. My name is Elizabeth Mayer, and I am the Preservation Librarian for the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, part of the Houston Public Library Special Collections. Today's program is the first in a two-part series that will be a beginner's guide to researching historic collections. Today, I will focus entirely on the history of the book, but keep an eye out for part 2, which will focus on the history of photographic processes. This program will be a historical retrospective on the development and change of bookbinding from some of the earliest bound books found in private and library collections to the modern bookbinding processes used today. I will be discussing how to date books using the context clues of appearance, condition, and binding styles, as well as discussing some of the small unique details found in books that can help to trace the ownership and history of a specific book, which is also known as provenance. Beyond being a fun research topic, there are a few reasons why it would be important to know the age and history of your books. The materials and processes used to bind books have evolved over time. Therefore, the condition issues that affect a book from the 1850s may not be the same as the condition issues that affect a book from the 1950s. Also, if you're ever planning to donate or sell a particular book in your collection, knowing the history of your book will help to identify the exact provenance. For example, is this a first edition? Is it a popular printing from its time period? Was it ever rebound? These are important questions that come together to help tell the history of a book, and these are the details that are helpful both for booksellers and for librarians, archivists, and curators. I'll begin our history of bookbinding by discussing books from the 14th and 15th centuries, or from the year 1300 to the year 1500. This is the time period in which you will likely see the most use of animal skin both as a binding material and as a material to write on. This animal skin is referred to as either vellum or parchment. Officially, vellum is exclusively calf skin, but over time these two terms are used interchangeably. One way to tell that a page is made of animal skin and not paper is by examining it up close. Parchment will have a slightly off-white to yellow coloration and will have both a smooth side and a slightly rough side. For paper, especially older paper, fibers will be visible on close examination, as will a series of thin, straight lines known as chain lines, which are markings left over by the paper-making process. During this time period, one type of binding that used paper rather than animal skin was early medieval Islamic texts. The paper on books from this time period is incredibly thin and delicate. It is also recognizable by the smooth, shiny surface that is achieved by coating the paper in a starch solution that aids in calligraphy and the laying of gold leaf. Books during this time are also often handwritten, and may have additional writings on the text known as Marginalia, as well as hand-painted illustrations. The binding style at this time was often simple and involved sewing folded parchment or paper together by attaching the folds to a series of braided cords. A book that is dated to this time period but has a smooth spine with no raised cords may be a sign that the book was rebound at a later time. Here we have a few examples of books that were bound in the 14th and 15th centuries. The book pictured at the top right of the slide is a Quran that was bound in the 14th century. The pages are made of a very thin paper that has been coated in a starch solution and polished with a smooth stone to achieve the smooth, shiny surface that you see here. This is a bit similar to coated paper that you would see in today's magazines or textbooks, but certainly much thinner and more delicate. All of the calligraphy is hand-painted, and all of the gold leaf designs bordering the calligraphy are hand-laid. The book to the bottom left of the slide is a 15th century book of hours from France. The pages here are made of vellum instead of paper, and all of the writing and illuminations are hand-painted. You can see that the page in this example looks a little thicker than the paper shown above, and is a solid off-white color. Books that were made during this time period are certainly going to be quite fragile. Even a book kept in ideal temperature and light conditions is going to feel the effects of age over time. There are a variety of condition issues that books from this time would face, with red rot being one of the most common issues. This is a condition specific to tanned leather, not vellum. This is when the leather starts to age and degrade to the point where it begins flaking away in a reddish-brown dust. A lot of different color pigments can also cause issues to medieval manuscripts. The pigment could be acidic or it could degrade faster than the paper, and it breaks through the paper. So for example, the image to the right here is from a copy of Commentary on the Ten Commandments, and this is one of the front title page images, but the green pigment used in this illustration is slightly caustic and it is burning away through the paper, so that top corner is actually pulling away from the rest of the paper itself, so we have to be very delicate with that. Pages from this time period are also likely to really start to degrade. Any form of wood or rag pulp paper is likely going to be very brittle, and any vellum or parchment could face tears or even gelatinization if it's kept in too warm of an environment. So keeping items that are this old in a nice, cool, dark environment is really important to being able to preserve these long term. The second time period we will discuss are the 16th and 17th centuries. This is the time period in which printed pages become a lot more common than handwritten pages. This is also when book covers begin to change. Earlier books were actually more often bound in wood, while from this time period onward, a paper-made board called pasteboard becomes much more common for a cover material. Books during this time continued to be bound in either vellum or leather, but paper began to be used a lot more frequently as a writing or a printing surface. This is also the time period in which stamped and gilded decorations begin to be used a lot more frequently, along with the title and the author information beginning to be added to the spine of the book, unlike a lot of covers from earlier books, which are often unadorned. End papers, the papers attached to the inside of covers of the book, begin to become a lot more decorative during this time period. Marbled end papers, where the paper is colored in decorative paint styles, weren't extremely common during this time, but this was when they began appearing. So here we have a couple of examples. We have a 16th century copy of Homer's Odyssey, and you can see it does have quite an elaborate spine design with a series of gilded lines, along with including the title, the author, and publication information on the spine. And below here we have a 16th century copy of Aesop's Fables, and we see an example of Turkish style end papers, which is when a series of pigments are dropped onto a liquid surface, and you can see the design is formed from the droplets of paint, and the paper is then laid down on top so that the paint transfers onto the paper. The third period we will discuss is the 18th and 19th century. This is the time period in which the mechanization of the binding process began to take hold. It is at this time when we begin to see books take on a much more uniform appearance. The popular binding style at this time is referred to as half or quarter binding. This refers to the use of leather on the spine of the book as well as the four corners of the covers. Paper would then be used to cover the rest of the cover boards, which was often marbled or otherwise decorated paper. Cloth also began to be used as a covering material during the latter half of the 19th century. Cloth used for bookbinding came in a wide variety of quality and style. A frequent binding style at this time was book cloth that was stamped and colored with a cover illustration. During this time period, we also see features that were very functional beforehand begin to become much more decorative. For example, the sewing style for books during the 18th and 19th century are often now on recessed cords, which means the cords fit into the spine of the book and the spine is now smooth. But because bookbinders liked the style of the raised cords on the spine, they created false bands that give the appearance of the book being sewn onto raised cords. Here we have a few examples of common binding styles from the 19th century. The photo on the left is a great example of a half leather style binding, one of the more popular styles of binding at this time. You can see the leather that covers the spine as well as the top and bottom of the cover boards. The remainder of the boards are covered with marbled paper. And the marbled paper in this example is a bit different from the Turkish style shown a couple of slides ago. This example is called a comb style marbled paper. This is a style where once the paint has been layered on top of the water, a comb with the very thin tines is run through the paint to create the sharp straight lines that you see in the photo. The photo to the right is also a common binding style at this time. This is a full cloth binding with a simple cover illustration that was stamped and colored with a small amount of gold. As was the case for the time periods before the 18th and 19th centuries, brittle leather and red rot is still very much an issue during this time. While leather was beginning to be used less, it was still frequently used as a spine cover. Paper made during this time period is also quite brittle. Because the paper-making process was becoming a lot more mechanized at that time, shortcuts were made that meant that paper wasn't quite as structurally sound as some of the papers made earlier. Another condition issue during this time has to do with the spine of the book. You see, at this time, adhesives were being used in addition to sewing to hold the book together, and if a spine was forced to open further than it was able to, the spine could split and more or less separate the book into two or more pieces. You can see a great example of that here in the image to the left. What happened was the glue that was holding the spine together was stuck just enough to the book thread that was sewn through the pages that once the adhesive cracked, the thread had snapped, and that's why the book is now in 3 separate pieces. And you can see a great example here to the right of red rot. All of these cover spines here have some pretty severe red rot. You can see the covers were meant to be a much darker leather that has totally rubbed away, and it's now this soft kind of suede texture and that reddish brown covering there that's going to start to really flake away like dust. The final time period we will discuss is the 20th century leading into the early 21st century. It is during this time period when the paperback novel began to be produced and made available at a much larger rate than before. This is also the time period in which faster and easier versions of binding styles were developed, each with their own benefits and drawbacks. In particular, if you own a book that was printed from the early 1900s to around the 1980s, it is possible that the paper in that book is in much worse condition than a book with handmade paper that was printed much earlier. For binding, adhesives began to be used almost exclusively as opposed to sewing through the folds of the book. Other fast methods of bindings at this time included staples that were punched through the sides of the book, or threads that were punched through the sides of the book as well. One style of binding in particular, known as perfect binding, was a very popular form of binding for paperback books. This is when the text block of the book is held together in a press, and a thick layer of glue is laid on top of the pages to hold the book together. Here are 2 examples of common binding styles from the 20th and 21st century. First, we have a standard paperback book shown here to the right. The pages are held together with a perfect binding, and the paper inside is slightly discolored from age and acidity. The photo to the left is also a common binding style. This is a case binding, which is a standard hardback binding where the front cover, back cover, and the spine are held together as one piece and are attached to the pages of the book with a layer of cloth or linen mesh underneath the end papers. The end papers are then glued to the cover to hold the book together. The cover itself has little to no decoration, but the entire cover is wrapped in an illustrated paper dust jacket that has been wrapped in plastic to protect the library copy. There are a great number of condition issues facing books made during this time period, particularly books from the first half of the 20th century. Increased production and demand of bookbinding meant that speed was prioritized over sturdiness, so many of the binding methods, perfect binding, staple binding, and stab binding, have difficulty in maintaining structure for the book over time. Pages made with wood pulp at this time can also become extremely brittle, to the point where even turning a page could cause a corner or an edge of a page to snap off. The best thing to do for books in this condition is to keep them in a cool, dry area and handle them as little as possible. The image here is A great example of what happens when a perfect binding adhesive breaks. You can see it's totally split down the middle. You can also see that the pages have yellowed significantly. The pages here are actually quite brittle. They haven't gotten to the point of flaking yet, but they are very close. Thankfully, paper standards have changed in the last half century to the point where the majority of paper produced today is acid-free or acid-neutral, meaning that the paper is going to last a much longer time. Improvements in adhesive binding have also been made that allows for the books to be bound quickly, but in such a way that the adhesive is still used and able to hold all of the pages together. In addition to binding styles, there are a number of small details found inside books that can help to indicate the history of a particular book. These can be anything from unintentional errors and changes to a book to intentional inscriptions and illustrations that are added to add value to the book. Inscriptions are some of the most common additions found in books. Inscriptions can be anything from booksellers' notes to autographs from the author. Inscriptions can indicate whether the book was a gift from a family member, or they can even be personal notes written from the original owner of the book. There can be condition concerns if a book inscription is written in a naturally corrosive ink, such as iron gall ink. However, inscriptions overall can be some of the most straightforward indications of provenance. For example, in the book pictured here, you can see that this book was intended as a Christmas gift in 1907. Marginalia are also notes separate from the book's text that can be found inside of books. Unlike inscriptions, marginalia is found primarily in the margins of the paper within the main text of the book, rather than on the front and back pages. Marginalia also includes more than just written notes. These can be drawings, annotations, prose, poetry, diagrams, among others. The example here is from a 15th century processional music book. You can see, if you look closely at the letters, there are a series of very exaggerated faces that were drawn within and onto the backs of these letters. These are known as grotesques, which were a popular art motif in medieval manuscripts and were added to the illuminated letters of the page. Printing errors can be an indication of a rare or early printing of a manuscript. These errors can often be quite small and hard to detect, which is how books are still able to be printed and sold with the errors still in place. For example, in the first edition of Alice in Wonderland, which was pulled by the author due to a disagreement over the chosen illustrations, there was also a small printing error in the table of contents that was later found and fixed with later editions. It might be hard to see, but in the last chapter title of this image here, the S on Alice's is printed upside down. Printing errors are especially useful for booksellers, as these can help to accurately pinpoint when a specific book was printed if the printing date is different from the copyright date. Similar to inscriptions, book plates are also common additions that can be found in books. These are small plates, usually pasted to the inside of the front cover of the book. Book plates are intended to note ownership of the book, so the book plate can provide a clear provenance for a specific book. Occasionally, if a book is sold, donated, or has changed hands frequently, multiple book plates can be found pasted one on top of the other. Libraries and museums will also use book plates to mark the item as part of a library collection, to mark the item as part of a specific collection, or to denote that the item was a gift from a specific donor. And finally, decorated foredges, while perhaps not the most informative of book editions, can be some of the most fun surprises to find. The foredge of the book is the open edge of pages opposite the spine of the book. Foredge decoration has been around for centuries and can range from a single color or gilt edging on the pages to an entire landscape painting. Book collectors, particularly in the late 17th and 18th centuries in England, would commission artists to paint a scene on the foredge of their book that would only be visible once the pages were fanned out. This technique is called a hidden foredge painting. Now, like I said, these don't normally have a lot of helpful information. However, if an artist has included their name, this could be an indication of when the book was printed, when the painting was done, where the painting was done, and perhaps even who might have commissioned the painting, especially if They wanted a scene that might have been close to the owner's home. This will conclude our beginner's look at the history of bookbinding and the study of book provenance. Thank you again for watching, and be sure to check out the second part of this program series, which will be released soon. If you have any questions, please contact our Texas Room Reference Service. Thanks again.